Mark Meckler, Convention of States. How are you, brother?
I'm good. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. Let me ask you a question. This fight over the debt ceiling. Even if we got everything that was in that initial bill that was passed, the trajectory is not fixed, is it, Mark Meckler?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I looked at the original deal, and, you know, as my dad used to say, it's better than the sharp stick in the eye, but not a lot.
And there's really the expectation that some people have or create that Washington is going to fix itself is simply not accurate, is it?
Well, it's certainly never been accurate in my lifetime, Mark, and I would argue that it's not been accurate in the entire history of the country. If you go all the way back to the Washington administration, the very first administration, every administration since then, with the exception of Coolidge, has grown the size and scope of the federal government. So those of us who love liberty, believe we need a smaller and less intrusive federal government, we should know by history Washington, D.C. is never going to do that.
Do you think the problem is that we have the wrong principles, largely free market, largely sort of constitutional conservatism and so forth? Or do you think that these elements within our society for so long have been eating away at the foundations that we need to get back and fix the foundations?
Yeah, I think, Mark, the way I would describe it, it's a structural problem. In other words, what we've done is we actually have broken the structure of our system of governance in Washington, D.C. Congress has done it. Presidents have contributed to it. Largely, the responsibility falls on the federal courts, who have exponentially expanded the authority of the federal government. That's why we have this big, bloated, overreaching federal behemoth. It's going to take structural reform to bring it back down to size.
And how do we get structural reform to bring it back down to size?
Well, there are two options. Option number one is we go to Washington, D.C., and we beg them to do it for us. And I laugh. I can't say that with a straight face because, look, they're human beings. They don't have the incentive to make government smaller. That's a painful and difficult thing to do, and it doesn't line their pockets, and it doesn't give them more power. The second way is we use the second clause of Article 5. We call a convention of states, and we propose amendments that will effectively impose those restrictions on the federal government.
Members of Congress, Republicans in particular, do you get many of them out there on the campaign trail when they're running for office or at all, at press conferences and so forth, and say, look, I want to get spending under control. I want to get the government out of control. I want to shrink the government. And so I support Convention of States. I don't hear a lot of that, do you?
No, very little of it, Mark. In fact, very few of them will weigh in. I think, they lack the courage to do it. And the reason they lack the courage, and it actually really drives me crazy, is because there is a fringe on the right that's against the idea of calling a convention of states. And when I say a fringe, I want to be really blatant and direct about what I mean. Maybe it's 5% of the Republican Party that doesn't want to do this. They're frankly now...
What kind of groups?
Saying this. Oh, groups like Eagle Forum, groups like Concerned Women for America, groups like the Birch Society, and they parrot the talking points of the radical left on this. And so I think with the politicians, it's not that they believe those folks. Mostly it's like, well, we just don't want to have the fight with them. We're not willing to stand on principle for this.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've asked a number of conservatives who contact me on this budget stuff and so forth, and they're off the record, of course, and I say, well, why aren't you getting behind convention? Well, I support it. I said, well, that's not what I asked you. Why aren't you getting behind it? Why aren't you pushing it? Why? We don't need to change our principles. We need to change the way we go about doing things. Yes?
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, so this is my point, is a lot of folks are just simply afraid to engage in the fight. Or they'll say, Mark, well, I'm in Congress. That's not really my fight because it's not up to Congress to call the convention. It's up to the states to call the convention. And while that's technically true, the fight belongs to all of us, because if what we believe in are the principles that we say we believe in, a smaller government, a limited government, a government where the citizen is bigger and the federal government is smaller, well, then we have to fight on principle. And this is the most principled stand for federalism that anybody in our system of government could take. And so they need to stand on principle.
Plus, aren't they citizens of the United States?
Yeah, this is what I don't understand, Mark, is this is the fight of our lives. We are watching the republic collapse all around us. We are proposing solutions in Washington, D.C. right now that won't fix the problems that ail us. And I'm going to be a little bit even maybe more doomsday. If we were to elect a Republican House majority in the coming election, and so now you have the House and the Senate, if we were to defeat President Biden with a conservative president, I am not hopeful that president and that Congress would shrink our government, because history tells me otherwise.
And you would have judicial challenges, you would have sabotage by the bureaucracy, you would have all these things that take place because, in my view, the Marxist left now, they know what they're doing. They know what they've conquered. They know what they devoured. And so the only way to, or one of the only significant ways, let me put it that way, to actually effectively push back is a tough process, but it's a process we need to get behind, and that is to put back in the Constitution what the courts took out. Now, people say to me, Mark Meckler, but if they don't adhere to that, well, if they don't adhere to that, it's over. It's over.
Yeah,
There's nothing we can do beyond that.
People who say that, Mark, we have a new term for them. I call them bunker Republicans, bunker conservatives. In other words, all they want to do is go to their bunker and hide out. And they're not willing to engage in the process, and they're not willing to fight for the country, and they've essentially given up. And if they've already given up, then they should, in my opinion, to be blunt, they should shut up and go home and hide and let the rest of us save the country for everybody.
Do you find even many columnists writing about convention of states? I looked, I don't see a lot.
No, there's not a lot, Mark. And, back in the old days when you wrote Liberty Amendments and Mike Ferris and I started this project, I made some assumptions which have turned out to be wrong. I thought, man, if we get 10 states, people are going to pay attention. When we get 20 states, people are going to freak out, and you're going to see it all over the media. This is going to be the cause celeb for every conservative in the country. I thought everybody would get on board. I actually thought by the time we got to this point, it would be pretty easy to get everybody on board. Everybody would be writing about it. But you're right, except for the left, I got to say, because we get regular attacks from the radical left in the media.
Now, Mark Meckler, I received a text from my stepson, David, earlier today, telling us that at a press conference, Ron DeSantis endorsed Article 5 Convention of States to deal with, in particular, term limits in the budget. Now, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's great. And DeSantis has long been an endorser of the Convention of States project, so he's out there talking about it. Vivek Ramaswamy has openly come out and talked about it.
Beautiful.
Nikki Haley has sort of gently talked about it. She's sort of milquetoast on everything from my perspective, but she's talked about it more in the background. I think we're going to see this become an issue in this presidential campaign, and I think that's good, and I think it's important enough that it should be an issue.
Do you get invited on many podcast shows to discuss this? Any significant podcast shows?
Mark, certainly nothing at the level of you. Of course, you're at the very pinnacle of conservative media. I do a lot of media, but I would describe it mostly as, and I don't mean this with any negative connotation.
Local or regional,
sort of
right?
Second or third tier media. And I love those guys, really appreciate the fact they're out there doing it.
I do too. They're the best.
But very few what you would call national names have me on. It's just not something that they see as either important or on their radar. I don't get any opposition from those guys. It's just they tend to be focused on whatever the hot item is in the news is today, nationally. They sort of mimic the national media. So everybody right now, all they're going to talk about is the debt ceiling fight. And also, Mark, I think you and I are having a discussion here that's super unusual in the media, which is what's the solution? We all know the problems, and so we can lament the problems, we can point out the problems, but what you're bringing up is a solution, and you don't hear much of that in the media.
Imagine if we were united behind this effort. I mean, some of us are. Tell the story of Tom Coburn, senator from Oklahoma who passed away, real tremendous hero.
Tom Coburn was somebody that I had met when he was in the Senate. We had a couple conversations in his office. He was one of the most impressive people I ever met. He's a guy that was a supporter of the Tea Party movement, but never talked about it out loud because he didn't want anybody to think he was co-opting it like so many did. A real humble public servant. And towards the end of his career in the Senate, one night my wife Patty was watching television. She was watching Fox News, and she started shouting that Senator Coburn had said he was going to work for a convention of states. Now, I didn't know him that well, and we had certainly never talked about that. I called his communications director, and John Hart was his communications director. And I said to John, I just heard on TV that Senator Coburn is going to work for a convention of states. And John said, yeah, we did too. And we both laughed about it because Coburn was just a free spirit. He did what he wanted. And when I eventually talked to him about it, he said, look, I'm leaving the United States Senate 2 years early. He knew that he had cancer that was likely terminal. And he said, I just don't want to spend the rest of my life doing nothing. I want to fight for the one thing that I believe can save the country. And so he literally left the United States Senate to come to work for Convention of States. He spent the last 5 years of his life traveling around the country, working for Convention of States. I was privileged to travel with him and learn from him. Towards the end of his life, I remember, my wife Patty works for the organization. She helps raise the money. And she tried to take him off the road. I remember her saying, Tom, you need to rest. You need to relax. And he said, I intend to die with my boots on. I don't want to hear you talk about that ever again. And he worked until the very last, Mark, because this is the only thing he believed would save the country.
And I remember the last time I met him at your event in Virginia. And I gave him a big hug. You sent me a photo, which I have right here. This guy put everything on the line when he was in Congress, the House, the Senate. He fought like hell, like some of these other guys. And then he realized the system is too broken. That's why I don't attack Kevin McCarthy right now, to be honest with you, Mark. I think he's done pretty well with what he has. I would have waited this out a little longer. I wouldn't have voted for this. But they're all kind of stuck in this system, and they need to wake up to this fact. Particularly those who keep saying, we can do better, we can do better. Well, help us do better. Help us do better. Help us help you. That's the message I'm trying to get across, no?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I feel, by the way, the same way about McCarthy. I'm originally from California. Now I'm a Texan. But I've known McCarthy for a long time. I wasn't thrilled that he was becoming Speaker. He's done way better than I thought he would do. And I think, I wouldn't vote for this deal. I don't know how much better they can do. I admire the guys that are saying we should still fight also. I get that, and I'm glad there are folks that are stiff of spine in Congress. But every single one of them ought to look at themselves, ought to look at the state of Congress, and ought to say that's not the fix. We can be in here fighting. We should fight as hard as we can, but we should fight for the outside solution that's driven by the people. Every one of these people we're talking about, Mark, says they believe in federalism, but Article 5 is the ultimate act of federalism, calling a convention, and they all need to get behind it. One of the things I love you talked about last night is about keeping a list. Who in Congress, which of our quote-unquote allies in Congress are publicly in support of Convention of States? They need to speak out, and they need to speak out now.
And not that I want to get into it. Some of them are not. Not most of them, some of them. Which to me is a headbanger. I don't even get it. I don't. Yeah, and they complain. And they complain to me about, we can't get. So, what are you going to do about it? Go ahead.
Yeah, and to me, Mark, that's one of the most amazing things is those who say they're against it. There are only a few that I'm aware of in Congress. Literally, I think 3 of them. And when you ask them what their solution is, when you say what you just said, well, what are you going to do about it? They don't have a solution. Or they say, we need to elect a Republican House of Representatives or a Republican president. And I just look at them dumbfounded and say, really? So how's that worked out for you in the past? And if they're honest, the answer is it hasn't. And that's not to say I don't want to see Republicans elected. I want to see a Republican majority. I want to see a Republican president. It's just we have to have reasonable expectations about what they can do and what they will do.
Exactly.
And what they can't do and what they won't do is restore federalism to the United States
correct.
Of America.
It's 100% right. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think we should abandon our principles and find new principles? Is that the answer?
So, look, the principles on which the United States are based are actually eternal principles. And They're eternal. That means they never change and they never go away. And we actually know from our history that they work. This is the longest lived Constitution in the history of the world. The average Constitution lasts 17 years. We're pushing on 250 years. That's an extraordinary feat, and it is because it is a principles-based Constitution. So what we need to do is not abandon them. We need to actually return to them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very, very important. And that's why when you look at the Constitution, Mark Meckler is also a lawyer, they don't support mobocracy and they don't support autocracy. They support a representative, limited government where the different branches have different functions. The different branches have individuals who are appointed differently. And so they knew that they weren't creating the perfect document. They created these methods for amending, but they didn't want the Constitution amended easily. But they gave it to us because they didn't want violent revolutions. George Mason told us that, correct?
Yeah, look, Mason inserted this second clause of Article 5, or suggested it, on September 15th, 1787. He addresses everybody assembled. It's 2 days before the end of convention. It's basically over at this point. And he says, we have a terrible problem with this document. We gave the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give that same power to the people acting through the states. I'm paraphrasing here. And he asked the question, are we so naive that we believe that a government that becomes a tyranny would ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Now, they all understood human nature. They were great students of human nature. We have no examples in history of tyrants deciding to return power to the people that they're tyrannizing. And so he suggests this, and Eldridge Gary proposes the language for the second clause of Article 5, giving the states this power. This is incredible because Mason's notes reflect at this point that there was actually no debate. It says NINCOM, Latin abbreviations for no comment. No debate, no comment, and it was unanimous to insert this power in the Constitution. They all understood, Mark, that we would absolutely, undeniably come to this moment, and the states and the people would have to stand to save the Republic.
Mm-hmm. So important to understand our history, and you're exactly right. We've lasted a long time as a prosperous and free people, but now we're up against it. I'd say in the last several decades. Actually, I'd say since Franklin Roosevelt and before, actually. But we're definitely up against it now. There's no question about it. So, Mark Meckler, if people want to find out how to join or how to help Convention of States, where do they go?
They go to conventionofstates.com. They can click on to sign the petition button. That'll allow them to let their state legislators know that they're in favor. That's important in states that have already passed as well. We had a rescission attempt in Alabama. We pushed back this year. So in every state, that's important. Then they should click on the Take Action tab. This is the most important thing, Mark. Look, you have been in this fight literally since you were a kid, and you've been taking action your whole life, not just talking, but taking action. Everybody out there needs to take action. They need to be involved in the fight. So if they click on the Take Action tab, they can get involved in a meaningful way.
How many states do we have so far?
Well, we have 19 that I would say are officially in the docket. Kansas makes number 20. They passed it, but they have something in their state constitution that says that they have to have a 2/3 vote instead of a majority. That's unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution. So we're going to have to litigate that one. But I would say we're at 20 right now. North Carolina is pending. We've passed the House. We're hopefully about to pass the Senate. That'll make it number 21 and leave us with 13 states to go.
It's amazing how little attention this gets, except you're right, from the left that's scared to death of it. Well, now that you mention this, these things I've been doing and you've been doing, what do you make of sort of a new crop of some kind of conservatives who say, you know, you old-time conservatives and your principles and your way of doing business, they haven't worked. So it's time for national populism and all the rest of this stuff. I just feel like I'm dealing with I feel like I'm dealing with Marxists. You know what I mean? It's like, forget the history, forget the past, forget the guys that came before. And I'm not even talking about me. Forget all the great thinkers, forget all them. Today is the day. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, look, those people are not conservatives, Mark, because conservatives stand for conserving that which is eternal, those principles upon which this country was built. It doesn't mean that you don't move forward, but it means you maintain the eternal principles, you conserve that which is good and great and beautiful in the country's history, and then you build on top of that. You know, Mark, when the Tea Party movement started, this goes back to 2009. I remember one of the things that really bothered me, so this has always been the same, is there were folks in the Tea Party movement that pretended like people like you and others who had come before us didn't exist. Like we were the first conservatives ever in the United States of America. And one of the things that I understood is that conservatives always, if they understand what conservatism means, stand on the shoulders of those who came before them, philosophical giants, political giants, warriors that were willing to step into the arena. There is no ability to have this fight if those people didn't come before us. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge them, read their works, listen to their speeches, understand them, and then move forward on that foundation.
When you and I only have about a minute, when you and I started this, looking at this Article 5 Convention of States, I strongly opposed it. Until I read about it and thought about it, we both did. And I said, wait a minute, what the hell am I doing? This is exactly right. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, you know, I was on the record. I did a conference at Harvard Law, not a bastion of conservatism. It was co-hosted by a liberal guy who's a professor there. And I was sort of neutral. I just thought, I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I can't imagine you could actually do it. And then I did what you did. I spent the time. I got involved. I learned from people who understood more than me. And then people like you and me and Mike Ferris and Tom Coburn and Rick Santorum and so many others got on board. Now I am absolutely convinced that this is the primary way that we are going to save this republic.
All right, my friend. Thanks for everything, and be well, and we want to have you back. So tell us what's going on out there when you need to.
You got it. Thank you, Mark. God bless you, my friend.
And God bless you, too. There's a great hero right there. He's not all talk. He's action.